Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Randy Bach. We are here with an episode of um, Overturning Zika. It's a book, it's a Facebook page, it's a concept. I have actually had the excellent news today that my review article, commentary piece on what happened to Zika, analyzing the Zika microcephaly crash, is going to be published in the American Journal of Medicine this summer. So I'm very much looking forward to that. Um, if people are interested, I could probably show you a preprint copy of my theory and methodology and kind of the chronology of what happened to Zika microcephaly, where it went, why it never became fortunately, never became the horrific episode in human history that it could have been, that it seemed to have becoming from the evidence such as was produced in Brazil in 2015 and into early 2016. So just to recap, for those people not familiar with Zika microcephaly, Zika is a virus. It's very similar. It's almost a twin to dengue, which is endemic in Brazil and has been for decades, maybe centuries. And it's brought about by a mosquito, the same mosquito, theoretically. But there was the presumption that Zika, which had never caused a single human illness in mankind ever, was doing so, and was indistinguishable from dengue. There was no actual Zika testing on Earth at the time, and so forth. Anyway, so the theory kind of covers that. And then microcephaly, totally separately, it's a human condition of small-headed babies that's been around forever, from no specific individual cause, but associated with many poverty conditions, infections, being around chemicals, insecticides, so forth. Nobody really knows what brings on smaller-headed babies. It can just be random. Some of it's genetic. Anyway, those two things were put together as one causing the other, that somehow this illness was never, or this virus was never caused human illness, brought about small-headed babies, and there was actually no background data showing there were more small-headed babies, microcephaly, in Recife, Brazil, than there ever had been. But the whole thing took on its own kind of story, and it took off, and it became one of the top news stories of 2016. It was in the top 5 of world news stories, along with Brexit, which has stuck around. Zika, not so much. Anyway, we have had a number of video conversations about this, and I've been very honored to have a Brazilian law student with me. You can introduce yourself, and we can talk about the topic tonight. But just as a preface, one thing we hadn't covered before, and I'd like to cover today, is the Zika vaccine. There was a lot of talk about that, and that's going to be the topic for tonight. Why Zika vaccine? What were people doing in the meantime? What happened to it? And so forth. Anyway, why don't you introduce yourself, Neto?
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Neto Lostia. I'm a final year law student, and I've been assisting Dr. Bach with his research for almost a year now. And I'd like to congratulate Dr. Bach on his article. I haven't heard before that it had been published. So, congratulations, Doctor.
Thank you.
And tonight, I separated a few questions that will hopefully be interesting for furthering his research.
Mm-hmm.
So, doctor, let me know when we can start.
Yeah, please go ahead. I just want to say one other thing, which is maybe by the time you are watching this, my book in English, Overturning Zika, will be out. And so that covers it more in detail than the article. The article is easier to read. It's only 1,500 words. The book is about almost 30,000 words. And I'm going to be having a Brazilian Portuguese version and kind of a Spanish version for Latin America as well. So I would like the news of what I've uncovered to be able to be filtered out. And in the offing as well, I have a kind of a comic book and a graphic novel version for people who don't necessarily want to sit in front of kind of more thicker medical or scientific books and want to get the general picture of what happened. So I think it's an interesting kind of detective story. I compare it to Sherlock Holmes finding out things. So there you have it. If you want links for any of those things, just pop it in the questions or comments area, and I'll try to get on that. If you're interested in having us speak or promote this in any way, please let me know as well. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. Carry on.
Okay, so Our first question will be on the topic of vaccination. So, doctor, as you are aware, there's been a dengue vaccine in development, in its last stages of development, I believe. And considering that dengue and Zika are very similar, why do we have a vaccine for dengue but not for Zika?
Okay, well, that's an excellent question. There had not been a dengue vaccine all through the many decades of dengue being endemic in Brazil. And dengue is a big deal in Brazil. You probably know this better than I. You were in Brazil, and I've never been.
I had
Um,
dengue
oh,
as a
did you?
child. Yeah, as a child, I had.
Oh, we'll have to circle back to that. Well, let me just ask you a quick question. Yeah, do you remember having it? I mean, did you remember the symptoms?
Yeah, I was, I believe, 4 or 5 years old, and I had a high fever. I was
Hmm.
feverish, and I had these rashes throughout my skin.
Hmm.
It was good because I didn't need to go to class. I got to
So,
stay at home. But
so
yeah, the
what
symptoms
town?
are normal.
What town were you living in then?
At the time, I was living in Barbalha, which is a very small town in the northeastern part of Brazil, and
Okay.
dengue cases are common there.
Right. So again, my book covers this pretty well, but I'm not sure how you pronounce it in Portuguese. But we call it Aedes aegypti, the mosquito. Um, from the name, it sounds, it's obvious it's from Egypt, um, and it's an African mosquito, and it came across to Brazil at some point. Whether it came across with the Portuguese colonial um, settlers, traders, um, so forth, or with the slave trade, or more recently, I can't tell you. Dengue, people didn't really have a good concept of what viruses were until the 20th century, and people had a lot of illnesses. They didn't always know which one were virus, which one were dengue. They didn't have the names, so forth. But it's dengue has been in Brazil, causing millions of clinical cases per year. It's called break bone fever, because it feels like your bones are breaking, I guess. I'm not sure how it felt at 4 years old and whether you had any context. Um, I believe you will get immunity to that strain of dengue for life with natural a case. Again, this goes back to, a lot of our COVID discussions and so forth, but um, natural immunity is a fuller immunity because you've had the entire virus within your system. So if there's 25 or 30 different proteins and so forth, you will be able to recognize all of them in the future, as opposed to a vaccine, which generally tends to get one protein. So you just have a scent of one aspect of that virus. Anyway, so to answer your question, um, uh, why is there a dengue vaccine and not one for Zika? Well, I think that perhaps the impetus for the dengue vaccine was helped by, and this might be one of the excellent parts that came out of the Zika microcephaly panic, hysteria. I would call an exaggeration, possibly a false theory. But what happened was there was a lot of attention towards getting a Zika vaccine, and Zika and dengue, and we'll show this shortly. I could probably show it now, are nearly identical. They're very very close to twin um, viruses. And just as a physical or visual, this might help here. This is a kind of a GIF, however you want to pronounce that. Um, that I don't know if it's going to show in real time here. That's dengue, um, and it. And if you see it flipping back and forth or not, I don't really see it on my feed, but they are identical. They're identical creatures. There are probably 4 different strains of dengue, and Zika is pretty much right on par with it. So they're carried by the same mosquito, and so forth. So why is there a dengue vaccine now? Well, again, at the very least, dengue has been in Brazil since I think the 1960s, and again, it might have been earlier, but they didn't know about it, and it might have been there 100 years and so forth. Dengue and Zika are both African viruses, and they again migrated with mosquito at some point, on some type of ship, I assume, at some point. Um, and nobody. I guess people might have been trying to get vaccines to dengue, but in a way, the easiest thing is not to get not to get bitten by a mosquito, and to clear the swampy areas and so forth, and not be around mosquitoes. That's probably a difficult proposition in northeast Brazil, which is, tropical, equatorial, wet, and so forth. So, dengue is going to be, part of doing business there in a sense. And so, again, the cases run in the high hundreds of thousands up to 1 million per year, and there's different strains kind of, alternating through the years. At the end of the day, though, the research impetus was to find a Zika vaccine because of this Zika microcephaly. Dengue, aside from being identical essentially to Zika, had never caused microcephaly and never been noticed in the population to bring about microcephaly or any other birth defect. So the whole Zika microcephaly theory, just on the kind of that basis alone, would seem odd. That dengue, which is functionally and visually and genomically nearly identical to Zika, never caused this microcephaly, and Zika did. However, that was the belief in 2015, 2016, and frankly, it's the belief throughout medicine now. And here we are in 2022, nearly 7 years after the whole phenomenon, and nobody is saying the emperor has no clothes. I don't know if you know that children's book, but the emperor, you do?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, so the emperor pays somebody for beautiful golden clothes and so forth,
Yeah,
and the tailor just figures he could hoodwink the king, and he makes him a nothing, and everyone's nobody wants to say to the emperor that he's not wearing anything, except one child who really doesn't have an interest in it one way or another. But nobody wants to upset they don't really know how to deal with this. Anyway, so this is a little bit like that. Nobody is willing to say that Zika microcephaly might not have been all that, except for me. And so along the way, billions of dollars, billions with a B. So that's I don't know if you use the same word in Portuguese, but so that's 9 zeros with a number in front
yeah,
of it. Has been spent in clinical trials, and there dozens. I think there are probably 45 to 50 different Zika research institutions, or money, research monies going to separate institutions in order to produce a Zika vaccine. And along the way, God bless them, they came up with a dengue vaccine. And I don't know if it's really been promoted or pushed fully in the area in which it would be most effective. That is to say, Northeast Brazil, where dengue has been endemic all these years. But that would be the one good thing to come out of this. That along the way, while they were hunting for Zika, they found dengue. Now, the question is, why could they come up with one and not the other? And I don't think it has anything to do with the chemistry, the biology, the science, or the virology, or the industry, or anything like that. If you can do one, you can do the other easily enough. It had to do with the fact that Zika disappeared as a phenomenon. Why did it disappear as a phenomenon? Well, maybe the same Aedes aegypti mosquito that was carrying around the dengue just decided it didn't want to carry around Zika anymore, or it may not have been there that much in the first place, or it may have been there, but when they started testing with real, actual, live Zika tests that got better than in 2015, and where in fact they didn't exist as a concept because there had never been any Zika human illness before. So there was no reason to have any Zika testing or tests or laboratories, and there were no laboratories pretty much on Earth capable of doing any kind of Zika testing en masse. Anyway, so once they actually started getting more refined tests to be able to discern dengue from its near twin Zika, they didn't find any Zika. I mean, for me, that might indicate that maybe that the ones who thought they saw Zika in the first place were just seeing dengue. So it might have just been dengue all along in Brazil, and there might be some strains that look sort of like Zika and so forth, however you want to qualify it. But the reason they didn't come up with the Zika vaccine is there were not enough people in Brazil once they started coming up with the possible formulations of 2017, 2018, there were not enough people in the population to give it to who would be experiencing Zika, so they wouldn't be able to tell if the thing worked. And you and I discussed this a little bit before, but I'm going to show you probably some slides. The NIAID, which is the part of the NIH, National Institutes of Health. This is the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, run by one Dr. Anthony Fauci. You might have heard of him. Certainly we have in the United States. He or his organization, one or the other, proposed to actually infect people with the Zika in order to test the vaccine. So it's kind of a weird paradox. Like supposedly Zika is so bad, it causes microcephaly, and it's such a bad thing. We need a vaccine for it, but it doesn't exist anymore. But we need to have the vaccine because it's so bad, and it's so bad. We're going to give it to Zika to people so that we can protect them from it. So how does that all work? I mean, it's a very big ethical challenge, and we're going to cover that probably as we go on. Did that answer your question at all?
Yes, it does.
All right.
Okay, so the following question will be about this topic just talked about, the recommendation. So, in an article that we spoke about earlier, uh, there's this doctor. It's called Jonas Schmidt,
Hmm.
and into an interview, a phone interview for recommended that women should avoid pregnancies during this spike of Zika. If possible, could you talk a little further about
Yes.
what are the implications of such
Yep.
recommendations?
I'm going to do that. Let me see if I can find. I'm going to just show a couple slides. Um, I'm going to bring in a couple of these slides here. I'm going to backtrack slightly. This is from the Atlantic magazine, but this is all, there are public health doctors who work for the WHO, and or they might work for institutions that get called on by the WHO from time to time. I don't think the WHO would have kept a Zika staff on board because there had been no Zika disease, and so they were going for people with infectious disease knowledge in general. Um, so this slide is from the Atlantic magazine, I think 2016, and talking about countries suggesting um, waiting women to avoid getting pregnant until 2018. So the two years or so forth. So imagine if you're trying to get pregnant or already are, and you hear that message from your government, would you take it seriously? And if you did, and all your peers did, what would that actually look like 25 years out? Classes with no or hardly any students, baby stores forced out of business, depleted younger generation, unable to support the older ones. So this is, this is a kind of a sadness. Let's see if I, yeah. So this is another. This I think from the New York Times. Health officials in several countries, and here they're listed: Colombia, Ecuador, El Salvador, Jamaica, Territory of Puerto Rico, have suggested that women delay pregnancy. Obstetricians in some countries are privately giving patients the same advice, saying the risk of fetal damage during an epidemic's peak is too great. So this is sadness. This is, we always hear about misinformation. These obstetricians are getting bad information because, again, they didn't have my book in hand. My book has the benefit of being written, 6. I started this like two years ago. So I had the benefit of having a number of years of no Zika. I thought this right from the beginning that it was exaggerated and that it was going to be a lot of hysteria driven numbers and overdiagnosis. But even at its worst, and again, this is covered extensively in the book, compared to rubella, which is German measles. Rubella gives something called rubella syndrome. So if you are a first trimester mom and you get German measles, the odds are nearly 100% that your baby will come out with neurologic damage of some type or another, which is called rubella syndrome. And it's usually congenital deafness, but there are other issues and so forth. Even at its highest numbers, again, I think they were wrong, but even at its highest presumed numbers for the people who were buying into this theory, it was only going to be like 3 to 4% of infected first trimesters Zika mothers were going to get microcephaly as a result. So 97% of those mothers infected by Zika first trimester would be normal. And so in this case, obstetricians are privately giving the same advice, telling the risk of fetal damage is too great. Well, I think this is absurd. I know abortion was not legal. It's still not legal in Brazil, and there was a big push, to kind of. I think politically there are a lot of people who want kind of the Catholic restraints and laws, generated law to go down and have legalized abortion on demand in Brazil and other countries in Latin America. A lot of people used the Zika microcephaly phenomenon as a means to that end. But I think people over and over again are erring on the side of telling women not to have babies. Whether it was this not to avoid them or have abortions. Well, in this case, giving the same advice, saying the risk of fetal damage is too great. But this is kind of a repetitive sadness that people keep airing on one side of this equation. So I give everyone the benefit of the doubt. I'm not saying conspiracy, but I think that public health tends to be a little bit too. We have a term called Big Brother from the book 1984, but it's a little bit too Big Brotherish. It's kind of too. Taking the risk of life away without your choosing to have the possibility of absorbing some of that risk. And part of that is a problem because people don't have the access to the data that we do. It took me months and months to get all the data that I got, and I have a medical degree, and so I don't expect people on the street to be able to have absorbed this, but a lot of the obstetricians with MD degrees should have. So this is from 2016, El Salvador's advice on Zika virus. Don't have babies. So I'm going to just leave this here without comment. I did look up this particular health minister who said it, and I believe the health minister was a former current leftist. And again, I think for better or for worse, that tends to dovetail, coincide with a lot of people's pre-existing political beliefs. So a lot of times a crisis comes along, and then people do what they want to have said anyway. They say what they wanted to have said anyway. So my predilection would be towards life, and a lot of other people's predilection is towards kind of birth control, abortion, so forth. And I think people wind up putting the crisis in line with their other pre-existing demands and urges. That's just me. I can't prove that per se. That's just something that seems to happen over and over again with these cases. So here's the quote that you were kind enough to find for me. So this is Dr. Jonas Schmidt Chanasit. I assume that's his wife's last name. I think it's a Thailand-ish name. So I'm just going to leave the quote here. I'll read the second paragraph. This is going to cause a big problem. Many young women are not allowed or advised against getting pregnant because of that risk. I would be careful to support this as we know very little, but if you want something decisive, then yes, I would advise women to not become pregnant at this time to reduce the risks to the baby. That would be a strategy. So he's not coming out right off the bat and telling people not to have kids, but it's there. Anyway, I'm going to leave that for now and come back to our screen. All right. Did that help at all? Did I come to answer a question, or do you still have questions from?
Yes, you did. I believe we can go to the next question.
Okay.
So, okay, for my third question would be about the WHO, the World Health Organization.
Mm-hmm.
It's about a public statement in which they recognize the relation of between microcephalic babies and tropical diseases, which would be Zika. But at the same time, they do not confirm that if this relationship is causal. So in a way, they say, okay, so there is a relation, but we cannot confirm 100%. It's somewhat murky, but in many situations, this is exactly what how can I say the stakeholders need. So why do big organizations such as the World Health Organizations make this? How can I say murky, not 100% tested statement?
Well, that's a good question. In this case, because there was no real good data, they went on hearsay of what was going on in Brazil, and they jumped to the conclusion. I think there was a lot of pressure, and again, this is really the essence of my book. If you want to, follow along, those of you, I mean, not Neto, but those of you who are listening to this, this is kind of the essence of the book. Why everyone jumps on this train. The train's moving. Nobody wants to be left behind. Everyone kind of jumps on, even with their misgivings. They're not sure this train has enough fuel. They're not sure it's the right train to the right place, but nobody wants to miss out. If there's ever a crowd, I don't know if I remember being a kid in school, and there's a whole bunch of kids running up to something. It's like, what's your tendency is just to run up and find out what's going on. You don't want to miss out. So in the WHO, in this case, I'm not sure to what level they had skepticism. And, I have quotes again in the book. I mean, Christopher Dye, DYE, he was pretty high up in WHO, and he puzzled over what happened. Why did it all disappear? And there's Dr. Albert Ko. Um, He's, I think, head of public health, Department of Public Epidemiology or Public Health at Yale School of Medicine. Very, highly credentialed, elite institution and job. Um, he's wonders what happened to Zika. Where did it go? And it's not that Zika microcephaly per se, because not only did Zika disappear, but the microcephaly bursts never happened again, and Zika, as they believe, it kind of tracks with dengue, or maybe it is dengue, as might be, is all over the world. And so other places where Zika showed up, or they started finding it in India, Malaysia, and other places, there was no coincident microcephaly. So the whole theory should have been just shot down. And this is really kind of I think a big flaw, a big gap in the mechanism of science. You're in the law, and you will be. There's case law. Law is different because it doesn't necessarily have to be science in order to prove something, but you have to have argumentation, and there's always going to be counter argumentation, and presumably a judge at some point is going to gavel down, or a jury, and is going to decide which is which. It may or may not be true. Like, I personally think O.J. Simpson, if you don't know who that is,
I do. I actually do.
yeah, I think he's guilty. But a judge and jury ruled in his favor, and so he's technically innocent. So that's how law and science differ. I mean, I think there's a deliberation. There might actually be more deliberation in an open forum in law than there is in science, because at the very least in the OJ case, I think he got off. He got found guilty in the civil case, but in the criminal case he got off, and so he's innocent. But at the very least, all of the United States and probably all of the world got to hear the facts of the case. This never happened with Zika microcephaly, and this is, I think, an absence in science. So many things are happening, deliberations are happening, in these realms of public health researchers or epidemiologists or government ministers, and they're making the decisions without necessarily involving you to the same extent. Now, I was not going to be able to be the one to punish O.J. Simpson. If he had been found guilty, he wasn't going to come to my house and serve time. So it's going to be done in a different place. So we don't all have a part of the O.J. Simpson trial. We think we did because he's a public figure. But in Zika microcephaly, the public was literally involved. And so in OJ's case, whatever her name was, Nicole Simpson, I believe, she lost her life, and Mr. Goldman lost his life. And so those are the two people directly affected by the O.J. Simpson pandemic, or a panic hysteria, so forth. But there's an actual thing. There was an actual, if you want to call his actions a disease, there were two actual fatalities from his illness, and they were very provable. With Zika microcephaly, if we had Lance Ito and a court of law, such a whole nation glued into the facts of the Zika microcephaly trial going on. When I say trial, like a legal trial, legal briefs and so forth, and this could have been bandied back and forth. I think whatever the public health officials would have done, the public would have been like, no, Zika microcephaly, that it's not a thing. We're not guilty. We don't have to watch this anymore. And so I think that's what's missing in the medical realm, in a sense. I mean, I respect science and the scientific method, but there has to be a transparency. And I think that the problem is that I think excellent people, a lot of my top friends and classmates, and a lot of my friends now are scientific researchers, and I think they have integrity and they have interest and so forth. But it becomes a difficult issue to kind of point out. Again, getting back to the emperor's new clothes, I don't even know if people even think that there might be an issue with some of the underlying science. I talked to loads of people, MD, medical doctors, PhDs, both, and I've sent out my basis for the book and shorter pieces regarding it, and I've gotten almost zero responses from people across the board, because they know Zika microcephaly is true. How do they know it's true? Because they've said it's true. How do they know it's true? Because the people who said it's true, and they don't go through. It's either whether you call O.J. Simpson guilty or whether you call him innocent. Either way, it's not enough to just say it. You have to document why you think that. And for the O.J. Simpson trial, we saw a lot of the evidence. With the Zika microcephaly trial, which hasn't existed, my book is essentially that. It's called in English "Overturning Zika," which has a legal connotation. That's when you overturn a law. Something is a law and then it's not a law. You've overturned it. In a sense, this is being accepted as scientific law, and I think it's time that we overturn it. So I don't know if that made any sense. Did I get too far afield on answering your question to answer your question?
No, you did. I actually didn't.
Just say it one more time in case I've missed any part of it.
Okay, so the question was again about a statement made by the WHO, the World Health Organization.
Right.
So they made this statement in which they recognize the relationship between microcephalic babies being born and what they call a tropical disease, which would be uh, the Zika.
Hmm.
But at the same time, they do not, they can't say for sure that this relationship is
Right.
causal. So
Okay.
one is causing the other. Okay, it's there, but we're not sure it's the cause. We know it's there, so that's why I call it murky.
Right. Right. So I mean, I don't want to retread on my own path there, but I think they're hedging their bets. I think there are probably some people like Christopher Dye and so forth who might have doubts about it, but they're not going to say them out loud because it's going to kind of ruin the whole phenomenon of a lot of research money coming in. I think a lot of people, even if they didn't buy into the Zika microcephaly theory full bore, they might very well be in favor of the concept of it because it was going to kind of shake the trees, and money was going to fall down to the right places. The impoverished northeast of Brazil was going to get more attention. It did get more attention. Money's going to show up there. Money wound up going to moms who have microcephalic babies, and for whatever reason they had the microcephalic babies, they were going to get some funding. So they still are getting that. So you can look at those as benefits, and like, why would you want to upset the apple cart? Is the expression we have. By pointing out this is false, you're going to ruin everything. And my answer to that is, well, the public, there's an expense, there's a cost for all that. Not only is there a cost, if you had billions of dollars, you could spend it on something else. You could spend it on something, maybe building roads or building new schools or whatever. You don't have to spend it in this particular way on scientific research. That's not necessarily the fastest, best way to benefit that population. Maybe you're going to spend it on getting people technical knowledge so they know how to, I don't know, work in their own industries and have talents and so forth. So I think there's always a loss. There's an opportunity cost any kind of money you spend that it could have been spent somewhere else better. There's also the fact that people are living under fear. Again, I I have huge sympathy for the nearly, the hundreds of million, nearly, a billion families or maybe more of reproductive age throughout the tropics around the world. I think there's 3.4 billion people in the tropics, and there's, maybe 800 million women of reproductive age, and, a certain number of them in families waiting to have kids. And whatever the number is, probably a good fraction of them, if they follow this news or if they keep it in their mind, think that a single mosquito bite in the first trimester of pregnancy can ruin that child. So they have a cherished life within them, and one mosquito bite away from ruining it. And they don't know all the stuff we've talked about, that even if there were a mosquito bite, even if the Zika microcephaly theory were correct, that it would only be a 3% chance of getting it. And they could probably have ultrasounds along the way and show the microcephaly, that kind of stuff. If, the places where termination was possible and so forth, they might not persist. But this is in the meanwhile, the people who have their doubts and they have MD or MD PhD or PhD degrees after their name, Masters of Public Health, all these people, credentialed, knowledgeable, they should see this mystery time as a way of coming to terms with the fact that the thing may not have been there, and how, if you really want to deal with public health, you should deal with the mental stress and distress that people are having under the worries of this sort. And this is again what the comic book version, the graphic novel story, are going, and they're going to talk about kind of this human dimension of people thinking that their lives are under ruination potentially by mosquito. And it's hard to avoid mosquitoes in the tropics. I mean, I haven't spent as much time in the tropics as you have, but I've been in Puerto Rico, I've been in Mexico, I've been in various other and Costa Rica and whatnot. I've been in the tropics, and and if you're in a swampy, hot area, I mean, the mosquitoes are there. It's like it's going to
Yeah.
be almost impossible to avoid them. And so, how would you, try to be pregnant and avoid a mosquito for months? I mean, that's you're going to stay indoors all the time. You're going to wear clothing from top to bottom and sweat. I mean, it's just it doesn't seem so crazy now because now we're living under COVID lockdowns here and there on Earth, and so people have done all kinds of contortions with their lives. But this was, if we had never seen COVID and all this kind of stuff, this would be one of the most egregious, kind of like over. What's the word I'm looking for? Uh, Over restriction on people that you could imagine. And I think it's a horrible, giving birth is a blessing. Certainly none of us would be here listening or watching or talking if somebody hadn't gone to the trouble of giving birth and starting a family. And it's a huge leap. And to go have an additional stress of this theory, when in fact, a lot of the people on the top don't even necessarily want to endorse it. I think that's the real cost. So there's the billions of dollars of research and kind of this research industry that goes along. And the other part of it is that, that there's a kind of an endemic fear that persists with people because they worry, because they've listened to the WHO and so forth, who has never come back and told them, hey, chill, we were wrong. This may not be really a thing. And if it is a thing, we're going to get back to you, really. But in the meantime, just go about living your lives. We're not seeing any microcephaly spots or hot spots anywhere, not even in Brazil, not even in Recife, Brazil. So if it's all gone, once we got the Zika testing, we started checking microcephaly better. We just don't see it anymore. So maybe it was real, maybe it wasn't real, and that would be okay with me. And if they just went on and gave people the benefit of the doubt and that knowledge, but we don't see that. That's why I'm doing all this, frankly.
Okay. Thank you, doctor. So I can go to the first for question now. So uh, it again comes down to the BBC article into the interview with Dr. Jonas. So besides him, other health professionals were also interviewed by BBC, and one of the possible alternatives to women completely avoiding having children was for them to strengthen, to make their immune system stronger, either through a vaccine, which is impossible because to the
Mm-hmm.
previous date we do not have a Zika vaccine, or by being previously infected with the virus, which from a duty of care perspective, it may be a dangerous thing. So it makes it sound like if a woman has been infected with Zika, she survived and she didn't have children, she may safely get pregnant.
Yes.
But the statement was made with the basis of what? Because
Well,
we know there isn't enough research. So I
right.
ask you.
So I think that's again, presuming Zika microcephaly were real, or is real. Um, That's excellent advice. I mean, we see the same thing with, I would just go back to rubella, and we spoke about this a little earlier. When I was a kid, they had rubella parties. I mentioned this. So everyone would get infected, and you wouldn't have to worry about it getting it when you were, pregnancy age, if you're a woman. And I think that they're just using that template for Zika microcephaly. Uh, I don't think it's bad advice per se. And I think if you had Zika, you probably wouldn't get it again, and so forth. So I think that's fine advice. I'm just going to let it stand there. I'm going to do something that wasn't a question per se, because I just want to maybe get it on my, I don't know if we've covered this much here yet, but let's see. So this is along the way. This is an article from, let me just put it up here. This is an article from Science Magazine, 2018. So this is September 2018. So now we are, this is full 3 years after the Zika microcephaly was noticed in Brazil, Brazil's northeast Recife. So as, and this is what happened. I think people, people either liked Donald Trump or didn't like Donald Trump. But you got to give the man credit. Operation Warp Speed, Warp Speed is from Star Trek, I think. But it is as close to Warp Speed as possible. When you think now we are 7 years out and there's still no Zika vaccine, and COVID, they got multiple different vaccines within pretty much a year. I think think, yes, less than a year. I mean, they were actually ready in November 2020, and so they did within a year. So they did, something on the order of, where months where this took years. Um, so, and you can see the massive disorganization when the NIAID, the NIH, the CDC, et cetera, try to run this themselves. You have 45 different uh, trials. Nobody comes up with an answer. But it's interesting here that this is kind of like a question I'm going to ask myself, I guess, is as massive Zika trial struggles, researchers revive plan to intentionally infect humans. So let's just kind of highlight that part here. Researchers revive plan to intentionally infect humans. So this, first of all, implies they had a plan to intentionally infect humans before. Now they're reviving it. I mean, they didn't just come up with it. I don't know why they would have a plan like that to begin with, but I'm going to see if I can find I think I have the quotes in this. Um, let's see. So I have it here. Yeah. So this is the slideshow portion, but they can't find enough people to infect. So the problem here is, just read it here. Let's see. Investigators race to develop a vaccine. Now 110 million vaccine trial is at 17 sites in 9 countries. Unexpected, ironic challenge. Cases of Zika have plummeted to levels so low that most people vaccinated in the trial likely will never be exposed to the virus, which could make it impossible to tell whether the vaccine works. So, and here is our friend, Dr. Fauci, and I apologize. I like to, do his voice. So right now, there are no infections and certainly not enough to even think about an efficacy signal at this point. So to make up for the lack of new cases, other investigators are turning to an unusual and ethically complex strategy. Whenever they say ethically complex, that means it's something you probably don't want to do. So next year, starting next year, so this will be 2019, again, 4 or 5 years, 4 years out from Zika microcephaly, Science has learned that, Science the magazine, that they plan to test a vaccine by deliberately infecting people with Zika. So I don't know if this ever came to pass. I've tried to research that. I have not seen this. I think everyone just kind of gave up on this, because guess what? Here we have what was obvious, should have been obvious right from the get-go. It's called Zika's Vanishing Act. Now, weekly counts of new Zika cases have plummeted in North and South American countries. And now, mind you, there's no Zika. This is actually when they started having real testing, and there's no microcephaly bursts anywhere. So what do they get? Why do they want to infect people? I think they just want to do it because they want to do it. They have this thing. I was kind of giving an example of firemen who've just, sit around. And these days we have such great fire protection in our buildings. We have these fire, addressable alarms, fire prevention systems. So the computers hear it, and, a lot of fires stop before they get really going. And so the firemen don't really have much to do. And so when there is something happening, whether it's a heart attack or whatever, all the fire trucks show up, and they're really itching to go. There's something, there for them to do. It's kind of like they're ready, they've been trained. And I think a lot of public health establishments like that. They're like anesthesiologists. They got, months of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. And so they feel alive when they have something to do here. And they want to do something. Now that the Zika went away, I just feel like they feel as if their game has been taken away, and they have no real rationale. So they want to go ahead and do it anyway. Anyway, so this is a very interesting point here, because the ethical point is, is there reason to do this? So here's a bioethicist, Seema Shah, who says there's a compelling reason to conduct a human challenge trial now. The details are complicated, and it's important to have a rigorous review. So, I just don't know what are the good ethics for it. So here's Dr. Fauci again. If they're careful, we have no problem supporting it. So, just to kind of back off a little bit. So in this case, we're talking about an illness that they think is so bad, it causes microcephaly and so forth, that we want to give people this illness so that we can protect people from having it, even though it's disappeared. I don't know. Maybe I'm having logical issues here, but I don't see that as extremely logical. And as far as the bioethicist, people call themselves that, but I think the real ethics here would be, you know, we don't really have a fire right now. We don't need you firemen kind of chopping down our houses and putting water in our rooms and so forth because we're not having a fire. Why don't we wait and see if we do have a fire? We're going to watch out for fire. We're going to be very careful about fire. They're using insect repellents and all this kinds of. We're going to be very careful about Zika and so forth. We're going to be testing for it, and if we see something, we'll get back to you. But in the meanwhile, why don't you work on your vaccine thing? Maybe test it out on monkeys or whatever, and get back to us. I kind of find it weird that there's so little respect for the individual here and for the people who are actually in the tropics and living through this. And again, part of that respect is here we are 2018 from that article, and there's no real mention that this is not a thing, that people can calm down. Maybe they don't have to worry about getting a vaccine at all. Anyway, sorry for asking and answering my own question. Do you have any others?
Okay, perfect. So, doctor, for my final question, I want to ask about, see, between 2020 and 2021, we had approximately 127 cases of reported cases of babies being born microcephalic,
Mm-hmm.
and that's around 10 times less than
We,
the Zika spike of 2016.
right.
So, considering that babies are still being born with microcephalic, and Zika is still this usual suspect, this usual
Mm-hmm.
cause, what can we expect for the development of the Zika history in the past coming years after COVID, after things settle down?
Well, my feeling is that Zika is what it is. It's a virus that's like dengue. It might very well cause mild dengue, but neither dengue nor Zika, or in particular dengue with millions of cases per year, has ever caused any microcephaly. And if your basic twin has never caused microcephaly, I think there's very little. It's highly doubtful that its other near twin Zika would be doing that. I think microcephaly, as I said before, is an eternal kind of malformation. You call it a disease or a congenital defect. Has numerous causes. Some of them not specific. There is a congenital microcephaly, a genetic true microcephaly, which is 1 out of 10,000 births. And that's genetic. It's like albinoism. There's nothing you can do about it. Dwarfism. It's just a thing that happens genetically. So you have those cases. Those are never going to disappear unless people, pre-test or something like that. But that's unrelated to Zika. Microcephaly has been around forever. And again, you can look at the medical literature. It did not just show up in 2015 as like, oh, that's a new thing. It wasn't the case. And again, there's never been a specific other cause because the diagnosis is very diffuse. Microcephaly just means small head. Well, small compared to what? You have a premature baby who has a small head. So you have to do it compared to the size of the baby, the size of the family, the size of the ethnic region, and so forth. How far along the birth was, whether it's premature or not, and whether it went along with kind of developmental delays. And this is all weeded out, and we're using the right standards, whether it's standard deviations from the norm, or 3 standard. There's huge discrepancies in how this is diagnosed. So one of the reasons that microcephaly kind of went away is they became in Brazil a firmer standard over time. And this is again documented in the book that in 2015 there was no federal registry for microcephaly, and there was no firm standard from place to place, and even in the same city from hospital to hospital or doctor to doctor about which standard for microcephaly they were going to use. So when this became a big issue, that again, the good news out of this is that people took a closer look at microcephaly and tried to be much more firm about what was and was not microcephaly. And a lot of what people found was not really, what they thought, and the diagnosis of microcephaly in 2015 turned out not to be that. I think only about something like 1 in 100, 1 in 80 of the cases originally claimed as microcephaly in the full flush in 2015 and into 2016 turned out to be the case. And so those babies might be smaller than other babies and so forth, and some of them may very well have delays, so forth, but there was very little in the way of actual microcephaly, even in 2015. And when they looked at the comparison data and they normalized it with previous year data, which took them a couple of years to accumulate, but I think in 2017 there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, and that's quoted in the book as well, that showed the actual, supposedly, pandemic year, 2015, didn't really have any increase in microcephaly either. So again, it's something that's always existed, and it has some multiple causes that sort of associate with poverty. And these, that's called the torch set of infection, which is toxoplasmosis, rubella, cytomegalovirus virus, um, um, herpes, and syphilis. So, which is not a virus; it's a bacterium. At any rate, there's a few different things that are associated with, along with being near chemical plants, or having marital violence, and this and that. There's just a lot of different things, and there's no specific cause. So the numbers go up, they might go down, so forth. But there was no real spike in 2015. I'm happy the numbers are down overall. I think largely it has to do with better, standards of deciding what is and what is not microcephaly.
Okay, perfect. There's just one more thing I'd like to know, if possible. I'm not taking too much of your time.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, these are your thoughts to how things are going to develop in the upcoming years, right? So, do you think as research progresses, considering there's still a need for research, this is, how can I say, will be the broader spectrum of what we're going to find out about the relationship between Zika and microcephalic babies?
What do I think is going to be found out? Well, there's been a lot of studying of the Zika virus, and they've tried to see the association with genetic neurologic abnormalities, congenital neurologic abnormalities, and they find little things. They find this protein, that protein, this strain, this strain. But I think, frankly, there was never any good rationale to call Zika microcephaly an actual connection to begin with. There was no increase. I'm repeating myself, but there was no real increase in microcephaly when all the numbers panned out later when they got reviewed. And likely there was no real cases of human illness with Zika, and very likely the cases in Recife where the microcephalic moms were attributed to have had Zika, that was never done scientifically. It was bad science up and down, and so my feeling is that this will just be looked at some point as a case study of a kind of like a word of mouth hysteria that took on the guise of science, and everybody kind of like parted, and let this train or whatever roll through without stopping it. So I think it's a sadness. I think obviously people have moved on to other things in a way, and they don't think or talk about Zika as much. But I would like it to be an actual exclamation point, that we should have a stop and look at this and see what it was. Let people relax about Zika microcephaly, because frankly, it hasn't shown up since then. I don't think it will show up. I think it may never have shown up in the first place, either one, or one causing the other. And I think it's kind of a separate, not quite tragedy, but it's certainly an oddity that amongst all these dozens of institutions and hundreds of researchers and so forth, and billions of dollars, that nobody has stopped to point out what I see as the obvious, which is that the disappearance might very well indicate that it was not really that big a thing in the first place. And so again, that's kind of a push for my book. But you're welcome to look at the science such as it was at the time. There were a lot of people doubting Zika microcephaly. There are three basic premises of Zika microcephaly. Having all three have to be true for the Zika microcephaly theory to work. One is that Zika, which, and again, I'm repeating myself, Zika, which had never caused any human illness in the first place, was doing that all of a sudden, 2015. Why? I don't know. Number two, and there was no Zika testing, there was no clinical diagnosis at the time, so forth. Okay, fine. Why? And then it was never shown documented by research institutions. It was just leaked to the press and became a thing. Boom, like that. Number two, that these women neuropediatricians in Recife who thought they saw more microcephaly, they had no real kind of data analytic approach with which to make that assertion out loud. They could have thought it, And there were doubts about the numbers even at the time amongst the institutions in Brazil, both from the Zika and microcephaly aspects. And then again, part three, that one new thing caused the other new thing, when dengue had never done that ever in the history of Brazil. So I think all three parts are likely wrong, and it'll just be chalked up to a kind of tulip mania, one of these oddities of human kind of like we have a game called telephone where they start talking around in a circle, and the message kind of gets distorted and so forth. By the time it gets back, it's not the same thing it started as. So this is kind of I think more an exercise in human group dynamics and in a sense gullibility, power structures, the press, research institutions, public health officials, tendencies. I don't know. I'm not sure where to begin and end. Certainly there are aspects of COVID-19 which duplicate this. I mean, currently we're in this Omicron phase of COVID-19. It's not really COVID-19 anymore. It's COVID-21, if anything. The 19 was for 2019, where the Omicron from 2021. It's at least half dozen or maybe more mutations away from COVID-19, and yet people still act as if this is the ancestral version, the big bad bugaboo that was back then. So people are wearing masks like crazy over here. They're enforcing them in a lot of places and schools and so forth. There's no evidence to show that that is currently a severe illness. And mind you, it was never a severe illness for most of the population, young and healthy. So people do what people do because people do what people do. I can't stop it. All I can do is comment on it.
Okay, perfect. That answers my question. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Neto. I very much appreciate your time. If any of you have questions out there, please let us know. I'm happy. Frankly, I've been very honored and blessed to have as interesting an interlocutor as Mr. Locio, and
Thank you, Doctor.
he's going to have a stellar legal career. I can tell he's very thorough, and I am happy to have been interviewed by him. We might do one or more of these in the future. I don't know, but I've been very happy so far, and I'm happy moreover that he's in the law and kind of investigates these issues perhaps structurally. So that's partly why I chose him for this task, and I've been very much rewarded, I think. So there you have it. All right, thank you. Any other questions?
No, that's it.
All right, so I'm going to end the broadcast and you and I can talk briefly.